Hey y'all. Today, we're going to tell the story of one of history's great monsters. But between a great PR campaign and a concerted effort by everyone involved, few people seem to know the story of this man. So today, we're going to unpack the horrific tale of Leopold II and the Belgians in the Congo. But before we do that, a quick word from our sponsor.
Hello, friends. 'Tis I, Julius Caesar. You have to pardon my lack of a tan. I have not ventured outside in many months. It is winter here in Rome. But I am here today to tell you to please feel free to hit the like and subscribe button and turn notifications on. It would be a duty to the Republic and a personal favor to me. Thank you very much, and now back to the story of Leopold.
I feel like as kids, the history topics that we might become aware of is largely a function of what we're taught about in the survey courses that we learn in school, or what your parents might mention, or what you're exposed to in various forms of media. I was probably on the nerdier end of history as a kid. I watched the History Channel all the time. I read nonfiction history books from a young age, but there were holes in the subjects that I learned about. I think most young boys find the history of war interesting. It's kind of something that a lot of young boys find fascinating. But as far as regions of the world and the history of those regions, even at a baseline, Africa is a place that a lot of people in the Western Hemisphere just don't know that much about, despite it being the cradle of civilization and the site of so many important events that shape the modern world that we live in. There's just not very much taught to you or brought in front of you about Africa. One of the memories I have that really sticks in my head that kind of piqued my interest about a specific topic in Africa was riding in the back of my mom's car in the early 90s. And I was blessed to have a mother who has really amazing taste in music. And if we weren't listening to Steely Dan, we might be listening to Billy Joel. And I remember sitting in the back of her car on the way somewhere, listening to Billy Joel's 1989 hit, We Didn't Start the Fire. Now, for those who haven't heard the song, which is probably very few of you, this song is everywhere in pop culture. This is a song where Billy Joel references chronologically several dozen really important incidents or concepts or things in American history in the second half of the 20th century. As a kid, most of them went over my head, but like many things in a song, there were certain pieces of it that just stuck in my head because they sounded interesting or aesthetically pleasing. And at this particular time, the end of the third verse really struck me. I don't know why. I just always remember repeating the end of this third verse where Billy Joel says, U2, Sigmund Ray, Paola and Kennedy, Chubby Checker Psycho, Belgians in the Congo. And he really screams out that Belgians in the Congo. As I got older and I learned where Belgium was and what the Congo was, I didn't understand, why were there Belgians there? Were they there to make waffles? That was kind of the extent of my knowledge at the time. And why was it worth ending the third verse of this hugely popular song with a reference to people from this very small European country being in this vast Central African nation? Now, for those of you who have looked up, what that reference is about, it's a reference to the 1960 Congo crisis, which was a democratic crisis where the Congo kind of devolved into a coup d'etat and a civil war. But there's a history behind that event that I think should be more well known than it is. It's one of history's great atrocities and one of the failings of the world community to recognize something horrible that was happening until it was too late. So today we're going to walk through both how and why the tragedy that was Leopold II's Congo Free State was allowed to happen, and try to understand how it came to be, what the aftermath and legacy has been, and why the people of the Congo today are still trying to exorcise King Leopold's ghost. Join me now as we look at King Leopold and the Belgians in the Congo. So, if you're like many Americans, you probably don't know a ton about the Congo as a region, as a country, as a place. But the Congo should be one of the most prosperous regions on the planet. It is tremendously rich in natural resources: timber, rubber, tin, gold, diamonds, rare earth elements that make all our modern technology function, like coltan. It has a river large enough to power, through hydroelectricity, the entire African continent. But instead of being a thriving economic power on the continent, the Congo today is home to some of the poorest people in the world. Since 1996, a series of civil wars have cost more than 6 million lives. Now, unfortunately, that is a narrative that is hardly unique in post-colonial Africa. But what makes the Congo unique is that we can trace many of the issues that plague the Congo to this day back to the ambitions and greed of a single man, Leopold II of Belgium. Now, to really understand how the Congo arrived in the hands of this man, it's really important to understand the Congo as it related to the rest of the world and European colonial desires leading up to its eventual arrival as a colony of the King of Belgium. For centuries, Congo and the areas around it were largely unknown to European exploration. It is an incredibly dense rainforest, jungle environment, swampy, very plagued by malaria at the time, which European explorers would be wiped out by largely when they tried to penetrate into the continent. Coming from the direction of Europe, the Mediterranean coast was populated by hostile tribes like the Moors, who were very apt to resist European expansion, and the vast Saharan desert acted as basically a natural barrier to any European expansion south across the African continent. Sailing south down into the southern Atlantic Ocean was seen at the time by Europeans as basically venturing into a land straight out of Tolkien. When you read the accounts of European sailors from the 13 and 1400s, it's really crazy. They think that the southern oceans are the site of sea dragons and the hand of Satan coming up out of the depths to grab ships and pull them down into the ocean. Islands populated by ogres, and the mainland being populated by tribes with 3 legs and the heads of lions. The unknown was truly feared by population of Europeans who knew some foreign lands like India were filled with riches that they wanted to get to, but Africa was largely called the Dark Continent, not only because that was the color of the people who they encountered there, but because it was vastly unknown and mostly impenetrable. At the dawn of the Age of Exploration, when we have people like Columbus setting off for the Western Hemisphere to find a route to India, there were beginning to be innovations that would allow Europeans to venture further into Africa than they had ever been before. Advances in sailing technology that allowed for boats to sail into the wind, medical technology that allowed them to resist malaria to a slightly larger degree than they had previously, and eventually inventions like the steamship that would allow them to go up against the flow of rivers in Africa so they could get into the continent, since Africa is largely a continent where all rivers flow out to the ocean like most rivers do. Over the 4 centuries between the Age of Exploration beginning and the 1900s, most of the rest of the world, Asia, Latin America, these places are all colonized by European powers. But the sub-Saharan region of Central Africa is largely left alone. It is an insulated, naturally defended place where Europeans cannot get to. And while there are a smattering of explorers and missionaries who do make it into these places, it is not seen as an easy place to exploit for vast riches like India or China or places in Central and South America. It would be the eventual invention of quinine, a medicine that allows for people from Europe with no exposure to it to resist malaria, and the Maxim gun, the world's first true machine gun that would enable them to take on areas like Central Africa. Although there were certainly not levels of technology equal to Europe in these places, there were hundreds of different warlike tribes, and sending the amount of soldiers into these places that would have been necessary to capture them was very, very difficult in the age of the flintlock musket. Once they had machine guns, however, it became relatively easy to send a small number of soldiers who could take on vast numbers of more traditional native warriors armed with things like spears. While all of this is happening, on the continent, the colonial race has been on for centuries. The traditional powers of Europe are racing to gather up overseas empires that will be able to ship home the vast amount of wealth and resources that will make them into the primary world powers of their day. In a small corner of Europe, nestled between France and Germany, is a tiny nation called Belgium. Belgium has always been kind of little brother to the countries around it. If you know anything about World War I or World War II, Belgium is always a country that's getting invaded on the way to somebody else's invasion. It's very rarely the target of anyone's ambitions. It is simply something you have to get through to get to Germany, France, England. And in that small country in 1835, a child is born, Leopold II. Now, had he been born at most other times, his life would have been very different. Belgium at this point has evolved, at least from a government standpoint, to being a constitutional monarchy, similar to the UK, where they have a king, they're largely a figurehead, and they are at the whim of their parliament. So they do not have absolute power like monarchs of the past. At the same time, he is, from birth, the heir to the throne. He had an older brother who passed away before he was born, and so from the day Leopold comes into the world, he is destined to ascend the throne as the King of Belgium. He serves in the military in a perfunctory basis, which is very common for European nobles at the time to kind of drape themselves in the aesthetics of military glory, despite very few of them actually putting themselves in danger. But as the young king-to-be grows, he begins to display some very strange behavior. He is in an original marriage in the early part of his life. He's married to the granddaughter of the Holy Roman Emperor, an Austrian princess. They have a son. However, that son dies of pneumonia as a young boy, and it really destroys their marriage. They end up separating. And from that point on, Leopold is a strange cat. He ends up shacking up with a 16-year-old French prostitute. He lavishes her with money and gifts and gives her these vast estates and gives her a noble title. And what I think is very illustrative of the society and culture of Europe at the time, it is this act that actually hurts his reputation more than the eventual atrocities he does in Africa. That tells you a lot about how Europeans viewed the world. He is a known hypochondriac. He would banish anyone from his presence who coughed. He wore a waterproof bag over his vast and iconic beard anytime it rained. And he had anything made of cloth, clothes, tablecloths, bed sheets, boiled every day to get rid of germs. He's a very strange and methodical person. However, he was very, very detail-oriented and definitely a planner. And he applied those very early in life to one singular goal. And that was getting Belgium, an overseas empire, to match those of his European cousins. When we look at Europe at the time, France, right next door, is the established old world power, right? Like, France has been one of Europe's primary world powers for as long as Europe has been kind of the center of the Western world. Next door is the newly united Germany, the rising power that will come, to fruition later in World War I. But Otto von Bismarck has made Germany into this kind of industrial machine, and they are gathering an overseas empire. And then right across the channel is Great Britain. On the throne of Great Britain at the time is Elizabeth I. She is, in fact, Leopold's first cousin. I'm sure everyone has kind of heard that most European monarchs were in some way related, sometimes to kind of an inbred effect. And Britain at the time is the empire on which the sun never sets. They are the largest overseas colonial holder in history. So even before he ascends the throne, Leopold's looking at all of this. He's seeing the vast wealth flowing into these countries, their grand and magnificent capitals where they've built all these monuments and estates and gardens and parks and museums, all with wealth plundered from their overseas holdings. And he wants Belgium to join in that race. However, again, he is not to be an absolute king. His will, while important and maybe influential, does not make decisions. And even when he ascends the throne, Parliament kind of tells him early on, they're like, we do not have an appetite for overseas expansion. All the good colonies in their view have been taken, and the ROI on overseas colonies that are left just doesn't seem to be worth it. They are a tiny nation of 6 million people with not a very large standing army. Can they afford to send men and material over vast expanses of ocean or land to hold and exploit foreign places? In their opinion, no. However, Leopold was not a man to be told no easily. So he begins scheming, and his schemes are only kind of encouraged by the adventures of a man of his time, a very famous explorer named Harry Morton Stanley. Now, Harry Morton Stanley was a British explorer known for these incredible adventures he went on in Africa. He was the first person from Europe to chart the Congo River up to a certain point. And these adventures are read about by every European in newspapers, in novels that were published. What's very kind of horrible and also minorly humorous about Europe's view of Stanley is that you read about these adventures and you'd think he's out there alone. It's like him and maybe one other guy with their guns, like taking on the wilderness. And in reality, it's Stanley and like 300 local natives being forced to carry all his heavy shit. They're dropping dead like flies because of like exhaustion and hunger. And Harry's there in his like cool little outfit pretending that he's on this adventure. It's a bizarre dynamic. And again, so much of this story is kind of steeped in the strange and awful white supremacist racial hierarchy that governs all of society in Europe at the time. But as the stories from Stanley come back to Europe, Leopold is a huge fan. He's fanboying out super hard. He reads every single day in the newspaper about all these adventures that Stanley's having, and he wants in on what he calls the great magnificent cake of Africa. He wants a slice of that cake for Belgium. Now, at the same time, Stanley is trying to get Great Britain to invest in the area of the Congo Basin. He's describing this magnificent paradise. There's all these resources. There's all this cool stuff. And this highlights something that you'll see over and over again in this story, which is that all Europeans kind of view and describe Africa as if there are no Africans. They describe the land, they describe the resources, they describe all the opportunities for wealth and riches that are there, and always neglect to mention or act like it's like a minor nuisance that there are millions of people already living there making use of this place and all its resources, and that's just something to be dealt with quickly before, the rightful heirs and owners get to it. So in the 1870s, this famous explorer, Harry Morton Stanley, he rockets to kind of worldwide fame when he goes on this adventure and discovers a lost missionary and scientist, Dr. David Livingstone. It's been kind of recorded in history as this moment where he encounters him and says, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume." And these reports get back to Leopold in Belgium, and he decides, this is the man for the job. I must get an African colony. But again, he knows that Parliament, etc., is never going to sign off on giving him the colony he wants. So he decides he must take a different route than just naked colonialism, and that route is faux humanitarianism. Now, this is the age of an ideology known as the white man's burden. It is the idea that it is the spiritual and moral imperative of European white men to go out into the developed and undeveloped world and spread Christianity and civilization and kind of bring the lesser races to heal, because if they are left to their own devices, they'll just destroy themselves and harm the world. And it's the divine mission of white men to be in charge. Again, a lot of this is offensively steeped in white supremacy. It's just the nature of why any of this was allowed to happen. But Leopold understood he could leverage that ideology to bring support and resources to bear on his desire to rule an overseas colony. So in 1876, he calls together what he calls the Brussels Geographic Conference. Now, this is a gathering of explorers and journalists and what were called geographic societies, men who kind of explored and looked at maps and kind of like sat around smoking pipes and talking about foreign places. The goal of this conference was humanitarian efforts whereby Europe could improve and civilize Africa for Africans, which is the height of bullshit, let me tell you. This is not the goal. It is absolutely to rule these places, but that is the guise under which Leopold takes on his mission in Africa. So at the conference, he organizes the International African Association, which is maybe the most ironically titled group of all time, given that there are no Africans involved here. This is exclusively old white men in Europe organizing the International African Association, and the goal of the association is to make better the world for Africans, again, without involving any of them or asking any one of them what their opinion is on any of these topics. But it does win the support of several European governments, several prominent explorers and philanthropists, and it is at this conference where Leopold meets Stanley. And this is really a marriage made in hell. Like, if these guys had never linked up, this collab really brought nightmares to bear on millions of people that may never have been visited by these horrors otherwise. Stanley is hired by Leopold for the equivalent today of $250,000 a year for 5 years. Given that the British are not interested in the Congo like Leopold is, Stanley takes the contract and he's dispatched to the Congo with orders from Leopold to sign treaties with as many local tribes chiefs as possible and get all this land, on paper anyway, under Leopold's control. So he heads down there. He spends months to years in the Congo Basin, heading upriver, establishing stations that can be used as military or trading outposts by Leopold's agents or the Belgian government if they want. And he signs 450 treaties with local tribesmen. Now, for those of you who've studied American history and signing treaties with natives, very similar theme here. These treaties are absolute screw jobs. They basically, for the price of a few trinkets and gifts, get the rights to all of the tribe's land, all of their resources, anything the land produces, etc. I think it's put best by Christian de Bonchamp, who is a French explorer at the same time in the region, who says, the treaties with these little African tyrants, which usually consist of 4 long pages of which they do not understand a word, and to which they are told to sign a cross and have peace and receive gifts, they are a serious matter to European powers only in the event of disputes over territories. They do not concern the black sovereign who signs them for a moment. So, most of the tribes in the Congo Basin at the time do not even have written language. So the concept of sign this document after you read it, it doesn't even exist to them. They are basically told to make any mark on this sheet of paper and you'll get some free stuff. What they don't know is that they're signing over their people, their land, etc. And again, just like Christian says here in this quote, these treaties are not between these tribal leaders and Leopold or Stanley. These treaties are so that if other European powers try to claim the same land, Leopold's got paperwork, right? He's creating a paper trail here. Once he has all these treaties signed, Leopold can now lay claim to 2.5 million square kilometers of land personally. Now, that's an important piece of this equation. Again, the country of Belgium, does not want to be involved in overseas colonial activities. So what Leopold did was, he was like, cool, Belgium doesn't need to be involved. I will personally own this land. So these 2.5 million square kilometers are the personal property of Leopold II. He is, it's like he went out and bought some land outside of town, except it happens to be 80 times the size of the country of Belgium. But he immediately realizes, like, okay, there's a scramble for Africa. Lots of European nations are now starting to look at Africa as the last real place to be colonized. Me personally owning 2.5 million square kilometers might be looked at as not super cool when Germany wants land too. I need to get this recognized by the international community and get their stamp of approval so that they'll let me do my thing and I won't be bothered. So he goes on one of the world's kind of first PR blitzes. And if there's one thing that Leopold intuitively understands and is good at, it's spin. Okay, he would have made modern politicians blush. So he undertakes this tremendous PR campaign. He buys or sets up newspapers in all the major European capitals and the newly formed United States. And the newspapers begin immediately writing all these glowing profiles of Leopold and his philanthropic work, his efforts to suppress and fight slavery on the African continent. Because again, this is the late 1800s. Slavery has been abolished everywhere, including the United States, which was the last holdout to have slavery in the Western world. And it's become very in vogue to say that you never liked slavery and slavery is bad. So this is the first virtue signaling kind of, where these incredibly racist white people in Europe are all walking around seeing who can kind of disavow slavery the most and get the most good boy points for it, despite being vehement racists and white supremacists in every other aspect of their existence. So he's writing, all this stuff is being written in these papers about how he's just there to spread the Christian word. He wants to make life better for the Africans. He wants to make Central Africa a free trade zone for all nations so that there's no conflict. And he also does this really smart job of double dealing. He basically goes to every single nation and goes, hey, I know it says it's a free trade zone, but you guys are going to have most favored nation status, okay? Nobody else will. It's just you. And he said that to everybody secretly. So, every nation thinks that they are number one buddies with Leopold, and in fact, nobody is. So, he also realizes that there's got to be a first domino to fall in the legitimacy kind of row here. Some country has to be the first to say, we approve of Leopold personally owning all this land, and then the other countries will follow suit. And he realizes the other European powers who are gunning for overseas holdings, they're not going to be the first ones to do it. So he targets the United States. And in the United States, he contracts this wealthy Connecticut aristocrat named Henry Shelton Sanford. Okay, this is this very rich, well-to-do dude in Connecticut, which, still around today, his type. And he uses Sanford to lobby the current U.S. president, one of the most forgettable presidents ever, Chester A. Arthur, all right? If you've never heard any stories about Chester A. Arthur, here's one thing he did, and it was horrible. He sends the president gifts from the Congo, being like, the people of the Congo want you to have all this art. I'm going to improve this nation and then turn it over to the natives once they've been converted to Christianity, and I've built all this infrastructure for them. I'm going to use every dime of my personal fortune to build roads and schools and hospitals and churches, and then once they are a stable, self-governing people that I've taught everything to, I'll turn it over to them, and it'll be a tremendous story of the West helping the lesser races, which again, just steeped, this whole story only works. Everyone only falls for this con if they too are deeply racist. So Chester A. Arthur fully falls for it. He's like, man, Leopold's doing great. I saw this newspaper the other day that popped out of nowhere that said Leopold's awesome. Sounds great, man. Let's go ahead and approve that. And it totally works. It comes right at the right time because in 1884, Otto von Bismarck, the ruler of the newly united Germany and a rising power in Europe, calls what's called the Berlin Congress. Now, this is a meeting of the 14 major European powers that all have kind of colonial interests to decide on how should we kind of do rules of engagement around Africa, right? If everyone rushes in together, there's going to be conflict. Some white people might die, which heaven forbid, right? When you're trying to genocide and subjugate native people, you might shoot each other trying to do it too fast. That'd be terrible. And this is just kind of a classic European colonial thing, right? Some white guys in a room 10,000 miles away from the place they're talking about with not a single human being from the region within 200 miles of where they are, drawing arbitrary lines on a map, deciding who will own what. And that's what they do with this Congress, with Africa. They're drawing up what are effectively close to the modern borders of African nations. And so many of the problems in modern Africa can be traced directly back to this specific Congress. They had no idea what ethnic groups they were drawing boundaries around. They really just knew resources and rivers and a few other things. The nation of Rwanda, they had no idea what Tutsis or Hutus were, but they drew a circle around both of them, created one of the worst ethnic conflicts of the 20th century. This was the nature of European colonialism. At this Congress, Leopold makes all these huge promises about, hey, the Congo region is vast. I'm going to keep it as a free trade zone. I will never act as a commercial entity. None of this is about making money for me. I'm here to stamp out slavery and to ensure free trade for all my European cousins. And they believe him. He gets everything he wants. At the end of this Congress, Leopold II becomes the sole personal owner of 2.3 million square kilometers and 20 million people. And again, not one of the 20 million had any idea. They were back home. They were not invited. They were not asked. And overnight, they had a new king. Now, the day that he is given control of this area, he drops all pretension around humanitarianism and, we're doing all this for blah, blah, blah. Externally, he kept the act up, but internally, no more need for the International African Association. He declares it the Congo Free State is its own country, and he is the sole sovereign king, okay? So, personal ruler. And again, in his home country of Belgium, he's a constitutional monarch. He has to kind of acquiesce to the whims of Parliament. The people vote for their representatives, and the king is really only there as a figurehead. And he hates that shit. In the Congo, he says, in the Congo there is no stooping, right? He is effectively the god emperor of this area. He installs what is a very, very basic government infrastructure. It's effectively like a governor and a couple managers in country. But unlike other colonies where you might see the British have like a colonial governor in India who kind of wields a lot of power, the true government of the Congo was back in Belgium, like in offices in Brussels, and Leopold personally kind of ran the whole show. There were never more than a total of like 3,000 white people in the modern country of Congo in the entire time that Leopold owned it. There were usually more like 750 to 1,500 white people to govern and control 20 million Congolese. And really early on, you see exactly why Leopold's there. He immediately is on the hook for all the money necessary to develop and run a country that's 80 times the size of his home country. So what he does is he gets a massive loan from Parliament, which again he tells him is to like build infrastructure and like help the people out, blah, blah, blah. It's really to get the commercial operations of the Congo going. And he tells his new government that he's installed immediately, I need as much money as possible squeezed from this place as soon as possible, and I will not accept waiting. And so this is the beginning of one of the worst periods of time for the people of the Congo in their history, and one of the worst atrocities in human history. So Leopold needs as much money as possible because he's personally on the hook for all the expenses of running this state. And he says to the outside world, to the people that loan him the money in Parliament, that he's going to build all this infrastructure. He has no intent to do that. He knows that the Congo has two real resources that matter, ivory and rubber. And so he sets to work setting up an infrastructure to gather that as soon as possible and as fast as possible. The first thing he does is pass a decree that locals who harvest any of these resources, they are forbidden from doing any business with anyone except the state, right? And that means Leopold personally. The state and Leopold are one. His representatives are the only people you're allowed to sell any of your resources to, and they set the price. The majority of the country is usually just like subsistence farmers that have cut their little slice of the world out of very thick jungle. And he passes a decree that any vacant land is his. Now, vacant land could mean anything from the jungle to your vegetable garden, provided you're not currently growing tomatoes in it or whatever, right? So he confiscates the entire country overnight, and locals are told they need to start gathering ivory, rubber, anything else they can of value and turning it into the government for this money, or they're screwed. He outlaws all economic activity in money for natives. No Congolese is allowed to exchange goods for money. This is going to be a command economy. They are allowed to exchange their goods for these kind of brass rods that he issues as like a local native currency that's only good between the natives and themselves. The free flow of money inside of the Congo is destroyed overnight because that will allow for him to control all economic activity. Initially, as he begins to gather the ivory, which is really the main cash crop of the Congo in its initial state, he realizes that as long as there's a state monopoly that pays no taxes and has no competition, this will be, pretty good about making money, but there's very quickly some issues. He promised all the other European powers that this was going to be a free trade zone, and very quickly, other traders who want to do business in the Congo find out that the locals won't trade with them. They have to trade with the state, and they start raising kind of a ruckus. So he comes up with a genius plan, and that's that he carves up the country into all these districts, and he sells leases for like 30 or 50 years to individual companies. They're called concession companies, and they buy the rights to trade in these districts with the locals via his agents for a set amount of time for a set amount of money. However, Leopold is always a 50% personal owner in all these companies, and he levies taxes and fees on top of that. So he's making money despite the fact that he's now allowing trade. On top of that, he immediately begins issuing bonds on the Congo's, federal, like T-bills for the Congo, right? But he's just allowed to print these because it's his personal kingdom. So he is immediately flush with cash, and he's just trying to make as much as possible as quickly as possible. He sends out a ton of agents to trade with the locals, right, to buy their ivory. Now, even from the jump, the commission structure that he gives these agents, it's very obvious that it's designed to turn them into kind of the most horrible exploitative humans on earth. So it'll be something like this. It'll be, hey, if you can get ivory for 6, cents a pound, you get 8% of what it sells for back home. However, if you get it for 4 cents a pound, you get 10%. So it's a structure that incentivizes you to grind or steal or trick or point a gun in the face of a local to get the price that they'll sell you their ivory for as low as possible so that you will maximize your money. It is an incredibly exploitative structure, and it leads to immediate abuses. Now, to the outside world, Leopold is immediately telling other countries, other traders, the Congo government is not a business. If it gathers some ivory in certain parts of its territory, that just lessens the deficit that I'm taking on because I'm having to build all these roads and schools and hospitals to civilize these people. And if some of the Africans have to help us gather the ivory, well, that too is part of our holy mission to cure them of laziness. Again, like so many of the atrocities here are allowed to happen because of preconceived, horrific racism on the part of everyone who's supposed to be kind of keeping an eye on things. The outside world of Europeans believed that Africans were savage, lazy, allergic to work, and, if you had to whip them a little bit to get them to believe in, Christian work ethic, that's just doing actually a good thing. You're instilling discipline. They kind of looked at it as like unruly children. It is so fucking horrible. At the same time, Leopold's promises of like infrastructure for the country, again, he's not doing any of that. So moving anything anywhere in the Congo, which again is vast. We were talking about a country 80 times the size of Belgium. Anything that needed to be moved anywhere had to be moved by human beings. So we were talking about thousands of what are called porters. These are just humans throwing a really heavy box or crate or whatever on their back and marching sometimes hundreds of miles through the jungle. Of course, the natives were hired to do this, and by hired, I mean put in chains and forced to do it immediately with threats of violence to them or their families. Thousands of porters will die even in the initial months of the existence of the Congo. But over time, over the first couple years, the priorities of this Congo state owned by Leopold shift from ivory to rubber. And that can be traced to, in 1887, John Dunlop of the tire company fame invents the rubber bicycle tire and inner tube. This is at the same time when electricity and the automobile are right about to explode into the public consciousness. And so demand for rubber kind of overnight spreads like crazy. At this time, there is no kind of infrastructure for developing, growing, and harvesting rubber. And so it is places where rubber grows in the wild that become the source of rubber for the world. And that's Southeast Asia, Latin America, and Leopold's Congo. Unfortunately, as the priority of the government shifts to rubber, the population really begins to suffer. As the price rises and it becomes Leopold's cash cow, it becomes some of the most horrible atrocities that are ever visited on the people in the name of what's called the rubber terror. Violence becomes the currency of the realm. Even minor infractions against the Belgian rulers is met with horrendous violence. In 1891, as rubber is beginning to rise in price, Leopold issues a decree that effectively reduces the population of the country into serfs. Individual districts and villages are issued rubber quotas, and if they don't meet these quotas, then they will be killed. Entire villages are slaughtered if they do not meet the demands of the rubber regime. State or company troops would kill everyone, shoot them, or burn a village to the ground to eliminate villages nearby. Women and children were taken as hostages. And what's even more horrible about this is that as time goes on and the quotas go up because there's more and more money involved, these acts of violence escalate as well. I also think it's important here to understand just how difficult harvesting rubber is in the Congo at this time. So if you look at like Brazil, for instance, rubber is in trees. And while it's still dangerous and a very labor-intensive process to tap a tree and get the rubber latex out, it is totally different in the Congo. In the Congo, rubber is trapped in vines, okay? What they would do is they would walk into the jungle and try to find these wild vines, slash them, and let the latex drip all over their bodies. And then it would be scraped painfully from them after it had hardened, taking even their hair with it. And again, because this is wild rubber, if you live in a village and you harvested all the vines near your village and you still need to meet the quota, you might have to walk for days to find enough wild rubber to meet these exorbitant quotas under pain of death. Meanwhile, your wife and children have been taken hostage by, foreign invaders. It is immediately a reign of terror. Now, in order to enforce all these quotas and rules and, frankly, to put down what were almost immediate mutinies, rebellions, and protests, Leopold realized very early on that he was going to need an enforcement arm, right? So the greater and greater demands in his private colony for rubber and for money necessitated the formation of what he called the Force Publique in 1888. And this is basically just Leopold's private army, all right? And he calls it the Force Publique. He tells the world it's so that they can, stamp out crime and keep slave traders out of the Congo and make safe the world for Africans who, they're a little bit savage. They don't know how to behave themselves. So you need discipline, right? And everyone buys that. Now, it's important to understand that the Force Publique is basically a commercial security force. It is there primarily to enforce the commercial whims of the state, which is Leopold. Like, they don't really care about crime. They don't really care about protecting anyone. They care about the quotas being met. So, and they even use language that we will come to understand later. In 70 years later, when the American forces are in Vietnam, they talk about pacification of villages that rise up. The Force Publique used the exact same term, pacification reconnaissance, going deep into the jungle to find villages that hadn't met their quota and pacifying them. The Force Publique had a white-only officer corps, was mostly made up of Belgians, but also white mercenaries from other areas of Europe. And again, it's talked about how they're publicly suppressing the slave trade, but in reality, to fill the ranks of the Force Publique, which again, the officers are white, but they wanted the rank and file to be black so that it would be black people doing the violence to other black people. The first ranks of the Force Publique were filled with slaves that Leopold bought en masse from slave traders on the continent. So he's completely going against what he told the entire rest of the world he was going to do, unsurprisingly. Their primary goal, again, was to reduce all the natives to corvée laborers, right? To put these people in irons, hold hostages, make sure the quotas are met, and mete out punishment if they don't meet those quotas. To grow this force to the level it needed to be grown, and eventually the Force Publique would be the largest and most powerful military force on the continent, they needed a continual supply of Congolese soldiers, right? They couldn't get enough from outside. Buying slaves was too expensive. And it was difficult to find Congolese who would do violence to other Congolese to the level that they needed. So one of the ways that the Belgians found to fill the ranks of the Force Publique was to start these Catholic orphanages. Okay, they're Catholic missions. And this is not an attack against the Catholic Church or Catholics in general. The Catholic missions that the Belgians ran were just extensions of the state. And what they would do is they'd bring orphans to these missions. Now, it's important to understand that in most of the tribal cultures that we're talking about here, the idea of like an orphan, like we understand it, didn't really exist. So they have huge families, giant extended families, and the village often raised children together. So like if someone's parents died, the idea of them being viewed as like parentless and without support is just a myth. Like that didn't exist to them. However, the Belgians would often, pacify a village, right? Like kill all the adults, take all the kids, put them into these missions, and there they would be trained from birth to be loyal only to the state and to do violence immediately on command. So after a generation, they have raised a very powerful army of very bloodthirsty, effectively child soldiers from birth who are incredibly loyal to the state and to Leopold. They are armed with modern weapons, and they are given what would become an icon of the violent oppression of Belgian rule, and that was the chicote. So chicote is a bullwhip made from sun-dried hippopotamus hide. It is a horrific weapon. It is to this day, it is a symbol of terror and fear among people in the Congo. 25 lashes was enough to make someone go unconscious, and 50 often killed someone. And it became, along with the rifle and the steamboat, something that just the mere sight of it had people fleeing into the jungle because of the horrible terror that was meted out by the Belgian soldiers. Now, the Force Publique would take their violence to higher and higher levels as the demand for rubber rose in Leopold's Congo. They became very well known for torturing and holding hostages. They slaughtered entire villages of anybody that even pushed back a little bit against the insane rubber quotas that were put upon them. They flogged and did acts of, let's call it unspeakable violence, if you get my drift here, to the women and children. They forced people to do those same acts to their own family members. This is one of the most horrific groups of enforcement people until we see like the Gestapo or the SS among the Nazis. I think it's also important to point out here that the white officers utilized black troops largely to achieve a degree of separation from the real acts of horror that are going on here, right? So as the white people are put in charge of these units of the Force Publique, they are able to feel that it's not actually them doing the horrible things because they're only giving the order. In the incredible book King Leopold's Ghost by Adam Hochschild, I think that is like the definitive book on this subject, he writes about how at Auschwitz, some of the Nazi doctors would say at trial at Nuremberg, like, oh, well, yes, I did experiments on Jewish prisoners, but I didn't do the lethal injections myself. I had other people do that. And it's bizarre logic and mental gymnastics to think that because you didn't do this one piece of a horrific crime, you're somehow innocent. That is definitely what you see among white officers in the Force Publique. They'll say things like, I meted out punishment, but the blacks did like the really horrible things, right? At the same time, the ammunition and weapons that the Force Publique are being armed with, it becomes like one of the largest expenses of the state. Again, they're not building hospitals. There's never a school built. There's never any of this infrastructure built. So the major expenses of the state are enforcement, and they're training and arming a modern army to suppress and enforce their rules. And the modern bullets, the cartridges that were being shipped down from Europe at great expense, became something that they wanted to keep track of. So they issued a new rule. The White Officer Corps of the Force Publique issued a new rule. They were worried that the black rank and file of the Force Publique might be using these expensive bullets for hunting, gathering their own ivory, or even stockpiling them for a mutiny. And so the new rule was, for every bullet fired, you must bring a right hand to prove that you killed someone with that bullet. Now, this creates one of the most infamous and horrible pieces of the Congo story. It is that the right hands of people become something like a currency. Over time, baskets of hands were brought to white officers when quotas were not met. It is an enduring symbol of the horrible atrocities in the Congo that there are millions of hands taken, both from dead people and, when soldiers did waste their ammunition, from alive people so that they could account for the rounds. It was widely tolerated that they did this because it added to the terror and submission of the natives, and that was the goal. Leopold was told about this system, and he kind of laughed it off and said, well, that's kind of dumb. Cut off the rest of them, but not the hands. The hands are the only thing I need in the Congo to gather this rubber. So this is just from the top down one of the most evil regimes to ever inhabit humanity. White officers became known by a local word that meant keeper of the hands. And there is a quote here from a local describing his local district commander in the Force Publique, this man who was notorious for his horrific ruthlessness. He said, all the blacks saw this man as the devil of the equator. From all the bodies killed in the field, you had to cut off the hands. He wanted to see the number of hands cut off by each soldier who had to bring them in baskets. A village which refused to provide rubber would be completely swept clean. A young man, I saw them put 10 natives in a net, attach a big stone, and throw them into the river. Rubber caused these torments. That's why we no longer want to hear its name spoken. Soldiers made young men kill or R-word their own mothers or sisters. So we are just seeing the most horrific side of human behavior to ever exist. It's worth mentioning here that the Congo attracted a certain kind of European. We are in a period at the end of the 1800s where Europe's been in a state of relative peace, and war and colonial expansion were kind of among the only routes for middle or lower class Europeans to drape themselves in status and achieve a higher rank in life than they were born into. So many Europeans who wanted to rise above their station, achieve glory, they would seek out these opportunities like in the Congo. And secretly, when they arrived, a lot of them really relished the idea of making money, but also wielding power that they could not at home, like true absolute power that allowed them to set aside their kind of Victorian sense of sin and morality. White European officers were known to take 10 African women as concubines, kill their husbands and families, and force them to bear them children, like real heart of darkness stuff. And that is something that we're actually going to get into right now. So at this point, bad reputation of the Congo is beginning to leak out. Despite Leopold's PR campaign and despite many people being totally chill with what's happening there, it's starting to seep out that bad things are happening. Leopold, at this point, has hidden for as long as possible how much money he's making in the Congo because he never wants to pay back that huge loan to Belgium. But on a dock in Liverpool is a part-time journalist and trader named Edie Morel. And Edie Morel was in charge of these docks on Liverpool and was seeing all these shipments go in and out to and from Africa. And he saw day after day these shipments of rubber come in from the Congo, and he noticed something, well, two things. One, all the ships going out to the Congo, they're being told that they're building roads, they're building hospitals, they're building up this wonderful life for the natives. The boats going out only had two things: bullets and guns. Bullets and rifles, over and over again. So where's all the materials to do all this infrastructure and teaching and learning and bettering? Two is, he realizes by looking through the numbers that the Congo's making way more money than it should. Even though they have all these resources, he's like, why are the profits so high? And he is the first person to make the logical leap, like, oh, they have slavery. Like, the labor cost is zero. And so Edie Morel blows the whistle to the British government on what's going on there. At this same time, in the very end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s, John Conrad, an author and in England, publishes his very famous short novel, The Heart of Darkness, like I just referenced. And it was a slightly altered retelling of his experience as a steamboat captain going up the Congo River 12 years before. And he tells in The Heart of Darkness the horrific things that he sees, the atrocities of local Belgian soldiers, and the central villain of The Heart of Darkness is this agent for an ivory company called Colonel Kurtz, who does horrendous things to the locals, including his garden in front of his house deep in the jungle is decorated with 12 or 20 severed heads. And that is actually something John Conrad saw when he was in the Congo. It's based on a Belgian officer who was known for that kind of behavior. And again, there's no consequences for doing that kind of thing if you're white in the Congo at the time. So John Conrad's book gets a ton of attention. It is kind of dredged back up that 10 years earlier in the 1880s, right after Leopold had taken over the Congo, a black American historian named George Washington Williams had gone to the Congo because he was looking for a place that black Americans could find an economic future complete with the civil liberties they were being denied in his home country of the United States. And when he arrived in the Congo, he was so horrified by what he saw that he wrote home to the United States and also wrote an open letter that was widely published at the time to Leopold. And he wrote all about the horrendous shit that they were doing in the Congo. He was actually the first person, long before the trials at Nuremberg, to use the term crimes against humanity. And this letter was widely circulated. It did begin kind of the groundswell effort to look into what Leopold was doing, and he was getting him some bad press. Leopold lucked out that George Washington Williams died of tuberculosis when he was relatively young, and so he got like an extra 10 or 15 years of ruling the Congo before other voices joined with George Washington Williams to shut this down. But even as the bad reputation is growing, Leopold is just totally disconnected from it. He cannot imagine people thinking what he's doing is wrong. He views the Congo as this like tropical paradise. All the people there are so glad for his wise rule. They view him as a hero. At the World's Fair in 1897, it's held in Brussels, and he brings 297 Congolese to be a living exhibit. He builds these like fake villages in Brussels and has them live in there, and like people throw treats to him like they're animals. He has to put up a sign that says like, don't feed these people. He is a bizarre and horrible human being. So as the 1900s get underway, the rise of electricity and automobiles is really thundering now, and the need for rubber is so great that it's just not going to be able to be met by wild rubber anymore. Other European powers like Britain have taken rubber plants to tropical environments that they own, and they're building these massive rubber plantations. The efficiency of these new operations, while not any morally better in a lot of cases, is just going to outstrip the capability of production of the Congo. After Morel kind of blew the whistle, based on what he saw at the docks, the British launched an investigation into the Congo to see if kind of there are these atrocities that are starting to leak out from various sources. John Casement, who is the British consul at the mouth of the Congo River in Boma, he goes to the Congo Free State and files a report, and it is scathing. He basically says this is the worst place on earth. They are doing things that are truly horrific, and it should speak to just how bad these atrocities were, that other white people at the time are like, this is too far, man, to Leopold. Casement's report says the root of the evil here lies in the fact that the government of Congo is above all a commercial trust, that everything is oriented towards commercial gain. And he's right. This is almost 20 years into Leopold owning the Congo personally. It has made him ungodly money, and he has not made any effort to help the Congolese. There are no new roads. There is one like narrow track locomotive that goes from one place to one place, and it's exclusively for moving rubber. There are no hospitals. There are no schools. He has done nothing to help the Congolese at all. At this point, there's a Congo Reform Association formed. Casement and Morel are among its strongest voices. Additionally, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote Sherlock Holmes, Mark Twain, Joseph Conrad, Booker T. Washington, and Bertrand Russell. These are some of the most prominent writers and thinkers of their day, and they are very publicly calling for an end to Leopold's ownership of the Congo. He just has done too much. The images and the photographs now that are starting to come out are truly horrific. They turn the stomachs of even the most ardent European racist. And in 1908, Belgium finally bows to international pressure. The Belgian parliament votes to annex the Congo Free State, make it an official Belgian colony, and Leopold is ordered to turn things over. However, he understands implicitly that if people ever come to know everything that he ordered done there, it would be bad for him. So before turning over control, he orders all records destroyed. And there's this famous incident where one of his military attachés comes to visit him in the royal palace in Brussels. And as the friend comes in to visit him, he sees that the furnaces are working overtime. It takes 8 days to burn all the records of the Congo. And he asks Leopold about it, and Leopold famously says, "They may have my Congo, but they have no right to know what I did there," which tells you the whole thing, right? Leopold basically suffered no consequences. He was paid 50 million francs, which is the equivalent of like $500 million today, for the Congo by the Belgian government for his personal sacrifice, which is bizarre. And he never answers for the genocide. He dies a year later in 1909, and having left behind basically nothing in the Congo, and yet he has built monuments and parks and museums and everything in Brussels with all the money that he was able to garner in the Congo. He becomes the builder king he always wanted to be. So what is the legacy of Leopold's time in the Congo? From 1884 to 1908, Leopold has personal control of this region. When he gets there, there's 20 million people. In 1908, when the Belgian government takes over, there's 10. Leopold and his lust for money and power has killed 10 million people, half the population. The country has been largely stripped of resources. None of the natives have been taught any form of government or how to do anything. They were basically under military occupation and tortured to death while they harvested rubber for a quarter of a century. Leopold, with his 10 million body count in the space of 25 years, that puts him ahead of Hitler, of Stalin, and comfortably inside the top 5 of history's greatest monsters. Congo, under Belgian rule, had to wrestle with its history of horrendous violence and oppression, deep ethnic lines that were drawn deliberately by the Belgians to maintain rule and order. And while Leopold was allowed to quietly die in his bed, the Congo to this day is still dealing with the damage and trauma that he inflicted on them. So this brings us back to the Billy Joel song. Belgians in the Congo, like I said, is a reference to the 1960 Congo crisis. In 1960, the Congo achieved their independence from colonial Belgium. They elected their first democratically elected prime minister, Patrice Lumumba, and Lumumba was a highly educated, well-spoken, articulate dreamer. He wanted to nationalize the Congo's resources, and he wanted to disconnect Congo not only from its colonial roots, but its economic colonialism as well. He wanted to be financially independent of Europe. That language triggered red flags all over the Western Allies. They immediately viewed him as a threat and as a communist. Less than 2 months after he was elected, a UN Security Council meeting that included the United States, the CIA director at the time, Alan Dulles, the French, the Belgians, authorized his assassination. The CIA would attempt to kill him with poison, with sniper rifles, with all manner of things on several occasions. And finally, they backed a military coup d'etat that brutally captured and murdered Patrice Lumumba in 1961. The leader of that coup, Mobutu, would become one of the most violent African dictators of the 20th century. But because he was willing to publicly disavow communism and allow U.S. and French military forces to stage operations inside of his country, he was given over $1 billion in aid from the United States and even more from the French and the Belgians. For close to 3 decades, Mobutu basically acted a lot like Leopold. He stole all the money he could from the natural resource wealth of the nation. He lived a lavish, luxurious lifestyle, largely far away from the Congo. He even built his French Riviera chateau within sight of the one that Leopold built for himself on the coast. And if you stood on his balcony, you could see the site where Leopold spent much of his time at his beach getaway. The legacy of violence and oppression runs deep in the Congo. When the Rwandan genocide happened in the mid-90s, it spilled over the border into what was then called Zaire and initiated the first and then the second Congo War. Those would eventually kill 6 million people and topple Mobutu's regime. Today, the Democratic Republic of the Congo is one of Africa's poorest and least stable regions. It is still wrestling with the deep, deep history of oppression and colonial terror going back to the days of the rubber regime under Leopold. It still remains to be seen if they will find their way out of the decades of oppression and legacy that have been left behind, not only by Leopold and the Belgians, but the Western powers that sought to maintain the lack of stability and disorder that was left behind with the death of Patrice Lumumba. This story is important because Leopold, while evil beyond measure, speaks to something that is often still present in our modern society. Greed and the lust for power lead to some of the worst kinds of atrocities in human behaviors. And if we turn a blind eye to them, they will be done to the extreme. Even when these things are stopped even if they aren't allowed to fester for a quarter of a century like they were in the Congo, the long-lasting effects and trauma can ripple out like ripples on a pond, doing unseen and unknown damage for centuries to come. Hopefully, the next time that we identify someone like Leopold, they can be stopped before they're allowed to let their greed destroy the lives of 10 million people. Thank you so much for joining us today. I know that this story is a downer. It's not fun, but I do think it is important. I am going to make an effort for the next couple videos to be a little more uplifting. There will be some cool stuff in here as well. But if you have liked joining us for these interesting stories in history, I please invite you to like, subscribe, leave a comment. I love reading the comments. Would love to interact with anyone else interested in these things. So by all means, leave me a note. But until next time, thank you so much. Have a good one.